Roll, I think we're rolling now. I want to just see. This is lovely now. There's 30 altogether. They were telling me in the whale, which is it's a great turnout of the fact that we've got 30 poets in Greystones. I didn't realise that.
Yeah, amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's very, very worrying on one hand because poetry. It's not it shouldn't be recommended.
I've read it before. I like some of it.
Okay, some of it just doesn't rhyme. I'm not sure what's going on there. Now we should say, despite the fact that you're Canadian,
yes,
you're a very soulful, deep, wonderful person who's got lovely kids who respond very, very well to interesting stories. In this case, It was on polling day. I don't know you have more than one kid, but your 8-year-old daughter in particular was impressed by a story you told her about Hilda and Hannah.
That's right. So it was polling day. We were making our way down to the polling station. We had the kids with us. And
what was the vote for now? Was this
This was the last election. Was it in February?
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So whatever the last one was.
Sure. They all blur into the one. Yeah.
And we were walking, and I don't know if it's a parent trick or just something I've picked up along the way. Is I love stories and I love interesting things about places. Like I'd look at any of these houses here and go, I wonder what that place was. I'm one of those people.
Yeah.
I want to know what something was.
You're nosy.
I'm nosy.
Yeah, okay, good to know.
I just love knowing, like, what things were. What were they before this?
Sure.
So when I take my kids for walks, sometimes because they get bored as well and they don't like to be traipsed around the town, I say, oh, come here, I want to show you something. And then I have a little tidbit in my head of a story I want to tell them that I've read about a building or a place or what was once there that's not there anymore.
Right.
So I have all these things. So yeah, we were walking down to the polling station, and just like that we just started chatting, and my daughter was holding my hand, and I said, did I ever tell you about the time that I got told off by my grandma for not voting? And then she said, well, why? And then the whole thing came out about like suffragettes and how people have dedicated their lives to getting the vote and how it's so important, and if you have a vote you should use it. And just I hadn't planned to do any of this, it just sort of came around. And then as we were down there, I thought, it's amazing that we have in Greystones this plaque down at the harbour, and I went down to that the day they unveiled the plaque, because I just think it is a fabulous bit of history that it happened right there. So I thought, that will be part of our story trail today, and so I took them down and showed them the plaque and told them the whole story and the windows at the castle, and how it's a long battle, and in some cases it still is an ongoing battle.
Sure.
And it just kind of came from there. So when I saw the submissions for the poetry and they wanted it about my place, not being a native Greystonian, I just thought, what was one of my favorite things that I felt really connected me to Greystones, and that was just sort of the most recent one, and so I thought I'd write about that.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, we should say it was October 25th, 1910 that Miss Webb and Miss Skeffington, they approached Mr. Augustine Burrell, who was the Chief Secretary of Ireland at the time, and they wanted to let him know in no uncertain terms that despite the fact that he was there to see our rundown, decrepit harbour, that in fact women's equality was quite run down and decrepit at that time. So that idea that your daughter really did sort of, I know you were saying she went to the plaque, and I know in the poem she sort of did, it did seem to have a deep effect on her.
Yeah, so they just sort of took it in, and I don't know if it was the content of the story or if it was just another one of the stories that I tell them. They seem, I feel like maybe as a mum, that sometimes when I tell them things, it sort of roots them to where they are.
Right.
They look at that place in a different way.
Right.
So I think they just sort of stood there. My son was with us as well, and I taught him, he was there for the whole lesson, and he was just as astounded that, women weren't allowed to vote. He couldn't understand that either. He's 6, well, he's 7 now, but, so...
Has there been any protests at home about whose turn it is to maybe make the breakfast, or whose turn it is to mow the lawn? Is there any...
Yeah. Well, no, they do like to help. Okay. I'm lucky my kids are at that age where they like to help and they like to be involved.
The rebellious thing hasn't kicked in yet.
Yeah, I'm good.
I think if you've got people like Webb and Skeffington in your mind, I think you'll always sort of have a fairly rounded idea of what's right and what's wrong.
That's it, and especially with women's history, it's easily forgotten.
Yes.
Women's history especially. So I always, try to make it a point. If I know a little tidbit about women's history in particular, I'll make sure to share it, because the more you share a story, the less it will be forgotten.
Sure. Now we should say that part of the inspiration too is that you're a big fan of the Whale, and they were the ones who were behind this Theatre Lane idea of like having a wall of poetry. And it is sort of it is a kind of, as I say, a wonderful thing, that 30 poems, you know, of kind of like a good strong selection of 30 poems. Well, that caught me by surprise. I don't know if you had sort of dabbled in poetry before, or this inspired you to sort of really go for it, because you're in music and theatre.
Yeah, so my background's in music and theatre, and I hadn't really written poetry, you know, as its own medium before, and I wasn't actually going to. I just thought, we'll give it a go, you know.
Yeah.
And I really like what they're doing at the Whale. I think it's a fantastic place, and I especially love how they are trying to involve the community. They're trying to bring the arts to people who mightn't necessarily, you know, partake in the arts because it always happens too far away for them. So this is right here, and I think that that's a great thing that people should embrace and get involved in. So I just thought, you know, I could be a terrible poet, and maybe I still am, I don't know, but I'll give it a go, you know, in a way just to challenge myself and to support what they're trying to do, you know.
Talking of which, here's Ross McFarlane now. Look at that big eater. He's such a rebel, that Ross McFarlane.
Yeah.
We should say now that this is partly, and we just wrap up with this, but I think you, like many of us, always had that grandparent who just liked to weave a story, and your own grandfather would always sort of start his, you know, did I ever tell you about, and suddenly we're off on another journey, which is hopefully not a dying art, because I think we do still talk to each other, maybe in different mediums, but that whole notion of just, because there was no, you know, I would say no distractions, a story like that could really kind of enrapture you, because you could get lost in it. That was something you recognized when you began to write this poem. Well, you're sort of in that area.
Yeah, well, it's just that whole idea of, like, you know, what happened before that I should tell you about today, and it just makes you think about the places that you are a little bit differently, and maybe have an appreciation for that place that you didn't have before. Right. You know.
Now we should say, because poetry is dangerous and leads to all sorts of trouble in life. You're over it now. Like you've had your moment.
I'm over it now.
Yeah, because you know it leads to all sorts of trouble. You know, you've got to be very careful. You're a young mother now, and you just don't want to go down that path. Your children to think about.
Oh gosh.
Nice.
I'll be an activist next.